Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephanie Pierce from the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Quality. Our office, in collaboration between the regulatory offices at the 4 local CTSA institutions in North Carolina, including Duke, UNC at Chapel Hill, Wake Forest School of Medicine, and RTI International, are pleased to offer educational seminars as a part of Regional Regulatory Forum known as REGARD, which stands for Regulatory Guidance for Academic Research of Drugs and Devices. These educational seminars are aimed at bringing together academic researchers, industry, and regulatory experts to discuss ideas, lessons learned, and develop strategies for navigating the complex regulatory pathways that accompany translational research. So before I introduce our speaker, I have a couple items I need to announce. I would like to encourage our remote participants to submit any questions they have in the chat box directly to the host. Please note questions not directed at the host will appear on the presenter's screen, so make sure to select host when submitting a question in the chat feature, and our host will announce the question as soon as possible. For our in-person attendees, please raise your hand and we will bring a microphone to you. This is being recorded. And also make sure to grab an evaluation sheet, and if you would like to get nursing credits, so make sure that you signed in and check the box for ANCC credit. And let's see, anything else? I think that's all I need to announce. So today I'm pleased to introduce our educational seminar speaker, Sandra SAM Sathers. Sam is the Vice President and co-founder of Clinical Pathways, a consulting firm located in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Her current focus of consulting is to promote clinical quality systems for sponsors and CROs and investigators and research institutions. She has over 30 years of clinical experience and has been dual certified by the Association for Clinical Research Professionals as a CCRA and a CCRC for over 15 years. SAM performs client quality system gap analyses and facilitates improvement for efficiencies, cost containment, audit readiness, and she is a subject matter expert in good clinical practice areas, including monitoring, auditing, risk management, and GCP regulations and regulatory guidelines. So we are very excited to have Sam Sathers here with us today to present her talk on developing monitoring plans for investigator-initiated clinical trials. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, everybody. So can you hear me okay? Okay. Wonderful. So I'm a registered nurse. I went to school at Niagara University up in the Canadian border, but I moved to North Carolina to do my nursing career. And I've worked at Duke as a nurse in the cardiology clinic. And in those days, then I worked in an intensive care unit at another local hospital. And I remember that someone came up to me, I didn't really know who they were not a staff member, said, if you have a patient that's coming in who's infarcting, give them A or B and fill out this paperwork. So it was a case report form, and it was the TAMI studies for thrombolytics, but I didn't quite know that I was a study coordinator. So that was my first introduction into clinical trials, and then eventually learned more about GCP. I had no idea what it stood for. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a really important topic, a very dynamic and changing topic as well. So when we brainstormed what to speak on, it was a lot of fun to take investigator-initiated trials into the considerations of the responsibilities of monitoring them. So let's talk about what we're going to focus on. And so who holds the sponsor responsibilities in relation to investigator-initiated trials? We'll talk about as a refresher, and then one of those responsibilities being monitoring, and we'll go into that context. And what are those expectations? And monitoring has completely been revamped in clinical trials very recently. We're going through a revolution in GCP. So that touches any group that does sponsor responsibilities. even outside of that, there's always been a confusion on the word monitor versus monitoring. And it really means monitoring and not the monitor. So one of the messages you'll see in the presentation is focus on the act of monitoring. Oversight is another equally, they're equal terms. If you think about them the same, it'll be easier to understand where you might have gaps or where you need to evaluate how you should go and oversee or monitor a trial. In investigator-initiated world, you know, we've had finally ICH E6 R2 GCP. That's a mouthful, right? It finally got revamped after 20 years. I think they were catching up. ICH E6 is the GCP guideline, right? The global one. And it's already been announced it's going to be revised again. So the next revision will come out around 2018. It's going to be in unison with ICH E8, which is a very outdated guideline on the design of clinical trials. So the design of a protocol. So an investigator-initiated trial would really need to know ICH E8 as well. So they're not going to change what they put new into ICH E6, but because this really had a huge monitoring impact. They're going to supplement a lot more of it. They just didn't want to shock us with so much change at one time. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about, so if I'm going to oversee, what's an oversight plan? What would be in a monitoring plan if I am required to monitor, and it's maybe something that is not that familiar with me, or I have looking at maybe different ways to do it in affordable ways. So if you look at how Pfizer monitors a study versus a post-marketing investigator-initiated trial, not that they're all post-marketing, which might be a single site even, the way you monitor, you would not be expected to monitor at the same level, but you would definitely have certain expectations that we'll talk about coming up. So just to fill in the blanks and get everybody on the same page, because I don't know anyone's level of expertise, and welcome to everybody online. So I don't mean to ignore you, but I have these wonderful faces in front of me. Is that ICH E6 in the addendum for GCP, and I've got a laser pointer, I can't quite see it, but there you go, there it is. It talks about a sponsor investigator, which is great to have a definition. And you'll see the same similar definition in FDA 21 CFR 312 for drug studies and biologics, and 21 CFR 812 for device. Anybody do device in here? Cool, good. I never will forget you. I know you sometimes you feel like you're forgotten, but you're equally likely to have an investigator-initiated trial as well. So the key words here, to be a sponsor investigator, and that's what FDA and ICH refers to them. In the industry, those that conduct them, much more likely we call it investigator-initiated trials, or IITs. This is the same thing. And its really key words are both. So that word both, I should have put in red. They initiate and they conduct. So they really do some conducting, like an investigator would, but also the designing, all those other verbs that we see in clinical research, is some of the sponsor stuff is also done. So they do both. Now it's not to be confused with when an institution sponsors a study and or organization like a corporation. So if it's a physician, say here at Duke, or a nurse practitioner, it doesn't, you know, in the world of regulation, unless it's your institutional policy, it really doesn't have to be an IND or an IDE. These applications don't have to be just held by doctors. So whoever's holding the IND would, to be a sponsor investigator, it's really, they call it an individual. So it's linked to a person. Not that you can't also, as an institution, be a sponsor of trials. Both have to monitor. So that no matter what I say about monitoring in the talk, it both applies, which is kind of nice. So here's the definition in 812. This is for device. And it doesn't matter if it's a post-marketing study or if it's a something that's not approved indication yet, or treatment for an indication. So same thing, it's almost identical in 312, except 312 adds a specific note that you must monitor a study if you're a sponsor investigator. So it's very clear, it's been in the regs since the 1980s, that a sponsor investigators must properly monitor, and whatever that means. That's why we're going to talk about more. So there is a draft guidance document that those in the regulatory submission area are probably familiar with. It's been draft since 2015, which is not unusual. It usually takes the agency about 2 years to get something from draft and from a guidance into a final approved version, or they retire it. And regulation takes about 4 to 6 years, but sometimes they surprise us. But this is still draft, and it's more so if you're running an investigator-initiated trial, this is to help you complete an IND and maintain one. And just a small part of it is saying, hey, if you're submitting an IND or any updates to it, please include a summary of how you're going to monitor your study. So this is pretty new. That's not in the regs anywhere, but it is a big deficiency noted within investigator-initiated trials when they're inspected. It is a common deficiency. Your handout, those online and also in the room, there's I hate to say juicy warning letter, but it is a warning letter that if you look at the most common investigator warning letters on FDA's website, they are investigator-initiated trials, more so than industry-sponsored investigator sites. And the reason is, I think, because they're more risky. So the agency around 2009 said that they were going to change the focus of inspection, and they've been evolving that since then. And one of the things especially was one of their focus was to pay more attention to investigator-initiated trials. And the reason is it's gotten more and more common and more popular to run these types of studies, not just because of an institution like Duke and UNC, et cetera. It's because sponsors have run out of blockbuster drugs. And they want you to spend the money first, and then they'll maybe buy what you've done, and then they'll take it to the next stages. But investigator-initiated trials, the institutions that where these sponsor investigators are, have started to want to hold on to this stuff as well and do multi-center investigator-initiated trials, which is still not as common as a single-site investigator-initiated trial. But we're seeing more and more multi-center. Hey, these collaborations are getting bigger and bigger, more popular. Also to help our patients, having it where they don't have to drive as far and collaborate with different sites. Plus, how many off-site locations does Duke have? Wow. I mean, UNC, I drive everywhere. I live in Chapel Hill, and I don't have to drive far to find a Duke center for sure. So this is a warning letter we'll refer to on and off. And what's really interesting is they don't always organize it as nice as this one, and I'll explain why coming up. So again, they want to know how are you going to oversee, so how are you going to do both roles, and how are you going to monitor, and especially if you're doing multi-center. The IND should be clear on that. So, and then they just define what a sponsor investigator is within this draft as well. So that's kind of the regulatory side. There's not a lot of guidance on investigator-initiated trials. So you really take from any sponsor guidance and investigator guidance, and you're responsible for both sides of the fence. So knowing that you have responsibility of being sponsor and investigator. I wish it was as easy as that, because sometimes the relationship is not clear. So for example, the manufacturer of the product that you're using might be giving you the product, and maybe that's their only responsibility, so that the GMP part. But sometimes they want to hold and be part of the submission for the IND. So sometimes it's not clear where the sponsor line ends. So really be very, very clear on who's still doing what, because it might be that you've got someone that's distributing product to your other sites that are part of the investigator-initiated network, And maybe it's coming from an industry sponsor that's the applicant or holds the manufacturing license for it. So who's responsible if there's issues? What if they send it and there's no IRB approval yet? Or there's not a contract in place? Because those things happen in regular sponsor world. So you have to kind of think, where are all the moving parts? So this sponsor warning letter, just flip through it really quick. If you don't have it printed out, don't worry, you've got it to look at. But in the first page, the first paragraph, it lets you know that this situation involves sponsor and investigator. Right away, they will let you know. So when I see them post warning letters, I get excited. You know, I go on and I always look to see, man, tobacco's taken the lead. We're not seeing as many GCP warning letters, I think because they're training up their inspectors to get up to date with risk-based monitoring and stuff like that. But when I do see stuff, it always introduces it as this is, you know, for sponsor and or investigator, here's both. So that's where I highlighted it for you. But then just flip the page, and we won't go through each one of these because we have a lot of good stuff to talk about. What they don't usually do is divide it into sponsor violations. So on page 2, look at the top, sponsor violations. And then way down later, there's investigator violations. But it's not till, wow, there's only one on page 8 of 8. The PDF cut the last little bit, like you've got 15 days, so don't worry about that. But look at how many sponsor issues there were compared to investigator. So that's quite a bit. In fact, again, the other statistic is important is there's not a lot of sponsor warning letters out there either these days for the last like 5 years, but we're ready to change. I can feel it happening because they're, again, the definition of monitoring, for example, is updated. But the most common sponsor GCP warning letter is for sponsor investigators. So that's another statistic to look at. Not here to scare you, because mainly you can definitely avoid these, especially if you look at when we get into the monitoring piece in this letter, which is the last citation when we come to it later. So this is just some pulling out of finding number 6 is the one that's related to monitoring, and we'll look at the details coming up. So let's talk about monitoring plans. So does everybody believe me that as a sponsor investigator, you need to monitor your studies? Not necessarily 100%, for sure, but how do I know how much to monitor and how to do it and who to have do it for me? The monitoring plan itself for sponsors was born in 1988 with a draft, or with actually a guidance document that was 8 pages long. It was very little. It basically said, write reports, go on site. Do a evaluation visit, and boom, you're done. And that stuck around until 2013, where for drug and device, they replaced it with risk-based approach. And they actually didn't even call it monitoring, they called it oversight. So that's finally, in 2010, they actually removed this 1988 guidance document. We had nothing for about 4 years. And then this final came out, and then ICH took another couple years, 3 or 4 years, to talk about monitoring plans in the November 2016 update to ICH. So within ICH, it's always talked about monitoring, and it defines monitoring as overseeing, okay, ensuring. So these are things that a sponsor investigator needs to make sure that they're doing. And it's not just relying on those that are quality controlling things, like your study coordinators. That's quality control. This is more of an oversight thing, independent review. Think about it, that I should be able to look at your processes and tell where the site function stops and where the sponsor function begins. It's really important. So there's this separation. So who does your study coordinating? Probably should not be your monitor for your study, okay? Unless you define monitor differently, because there are sites that have monitors that are going behind their coordinators and doing QC. That is different than a sponsor would be looking. It's not the same kind of monitoring. So you just need to be able to define that and very clearly describe that when someone from the FDA or a government-funded study, NIH or whoever comes and takes a peek. So this is new in the addendum is the 1.64, the monitoring plan. So this was not in ICH. Now, they call it a document. So you really should have a document for your studies. Most groups would have a template that would give them a place to start. What you might want to think about is a template for certain kinds of studies, because certain kinds of studies are going to need less monitoring. And if you've got a multi-center trial, you're going to need some more bells and whistles in your monitoring plan. And it may not be that one template will work and support people. So within it, you have to list your strategy. What is your strategy for monitoring? Meaning, I'm going to monitor 1% of the population. We're going to review remotely. We're going to, if we get a deviation, we'll go out and monitor, or we'll look at the first and the last. There's all these strategies out there. But then you need to defend why you chose that. So it's not, we always monitor this way is gone. It doesn't work. It is based on the risk of this study, this is how we choose to monitor. One, I've never been a sponsor investigator before. That's included in typically the risk. So when the FDA sees new to a role like that, it is one of the algorithm components that how they choose to go and who they choose to inspect. They don't inspect everybody. They'd have to have quite a huge team. So it's going to talk about methods and requirements. Big message. Follow your monitoring plan. Don't overcommit. Make it something so you can actually do it. So for example, in some device studies, the follow-up, you might have 8,500 patients, right? And they're being followed till they're explanted or dead. So if you promise that you're going to monitor every informed consent on those trials, and I've seen it happen, I think we've calculated we would need 99 monitors or something kind of crazy for a study. That'd be great jobs, but not for very long. So the monitoring plan and monitoring approach is really talked about in ICH. So the plan is going to help you oversee, but this is a big message as well. Think about it as cross-functional. Whoever's working on your project, they need to be involved in the decisions on how you're going to monitor. They need to be informed about it, like data management needs to know. It's going to affect their data management plan. Your safety reporting components need to know how you're going to monitor. And it might be that that's one group for a smaller type of study or a smaller type of function. But it is not, the monitoring plans don't just sit within the clinical operations, I guess you could say. It definitely sits, whoever's contributing to data going into the FDA or whatever agency it is, okay? It is whoever would impact human subject protection. A lot of IRBs want to know how you're monitoring. And IRBs do also know that investigator-initiated trials are something that they need to be aware of that are a trigger for some inspections. So the appropriate part of independent monitoring. So this is when I say the word independent monitoring, again, it's not the person who is coordinating the study. When I said that, since I have a live audience here, I could see some response. It definitely, and that's not unusual, where you've seen it happen, that somebody's doing multitasking with that. So it needs to be the independence of sponsor functions versus the site function. So a monitoring plan, here's what needs to support your monitoring plan. It's not something that you just have a template. It has to be supported by your quality system. So your quality system includes things like procedures and validated methods. So how do you run your investigator-initiated trials? Look at your current SOPs. A lot of groups have mainly investigator SOPs at institutions like this. I've never seen your SOPs, so I don't know. And commonly you're missing the sponsor side of the SOPs. So that's something to look at. And if you've got those in place, check it off as good because they'll be inspected when you get regulatory inspection. The other thing with validated methods, it means that people follow your procedures. Sometimes, not maybe this institution or those on the call, investigator-initiated trials sometimes are very siloed. They like to be siloed sometimes because they can get things done without a lot of rules coming from the main organization. So they may not want to have independent monitoring. They may not want to have a lot of procedures upon them, okay? And so just know that there's this balancing of making sure that people are following what they say they're going to follow. How are you going to ensure that you're adequately being a sponsor, adequately being an investigator? Is basically, sponsors by law have to have standard operating procedures. It's not an if, and, or but. Investigators, it's never been said you have to have procedures until ICH got updated, and it is in Section 4 of the new ICH guideline. It took about, 30 years. Now, documentation systems. Having monitoring plans will impact how you document things. What kind of documentation comes from the requirements of your monitoring plan? How are you going to prove you monitored? Is there reporting? Is there letters? Is there meeting minutes? Don't make it too complicated. You don't have to have monitoring SOPs like Pfizer again. But what would be the basic things to make sure that you can prove 10 years after the study closes that you literally did monitor and that you actually managed issues that were identified, that you followed your monitoring plan? The next is training. So a couple things. Training on sponsor responsibilities would be really important. Do you actually know those responsibilities? And then the other side of training is for a specific protocol. When you have approved a monitoring plan, make sure people are trained on it and you have documentation of that. Okay. So training to do the role of the sponsor, training also on the study-specific monitoring requirements. Validated computerized systems. Thank goodness, you may not agree, but HIPAA got updated in 2009 to make it so our EMRs have to be a little bit more robust and have more of an audit trail. You guys, Epic, last I knew, probably have a few different things. And these systems are really top-notch. They have this data integrity. So in other words, you can't change my note. Okay? It used to be you'd log into these systems and you could change a doctor's note. Now we've really controlled that. So you may be asked for SOPs related to your electronic medical records and or anything electronically that is supporting your study. And I don't know if you guys would have electronic monitoring reports like some sponsors do. You're probably lucky if you don't because they're really, really clunky, but they give you good data. Quality control. So how do you do your quality control for monitoring? How do you know your monitors are doing what they're supposed to be doing? So how do you track that they actually did the monitoring? That's not auditing. Auditing, could be later in the game. It's looking at a moment in time. Quality control is looking throughout time to see, am I actually monitoring like I promised? And then how is a monitoring plan going to affect where you focus your audits? So if you have an audit function that helps you within your organization, have them, make sure that they're looking at both the sponsor and the investigator side in these types of trials and not just focusing on the investigator side. So this all affects process, documentation, training. So how would it impact us to implement more monitoring, a different thought process, kind of a different approach to monitoring, and also during the project, how does it impact our quality control? So any questions about that? I've been yakking. Any questions from the peanut gallery online? Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, we're gonna record it, so let me get your microphone to you.
Hi, couple of quick questions about implementing monitoring plans for investigator-initiated study. You said you have to describe a monitoring plan tailored to the study particularly and get it approved. Who would you approve it for?
The sponsor function should approve it. Yep. Good question.
The sponsor, so for example, if it's in a disease group and we have an oversight body, that would approve it.
Depends on, and that's where your procedures, it should be an approved plan. So that's why your validated procedures should require that, for sure. Make sure that this individual, the sponsor investigator, doesn't get lost in this, that everybody's doing everything. They need to be informed. And commonly, it might even be their signature on the monitoring plan, or who they've delegated the monitoring, maybe supervision to. Yeah, because the guidelines and the regs define the sponsor investigator as someone who can work with groups of people. Does that help? Okay, thank you. And this is more detailed in here as well, but go ahead.
We do actually have a question from WebEx now. They say, is Epic EMRs a validated system across the board, meaning at all sites? How is this determined?
You know, that's $1 million question, because there is no, Part 11. So think about 21 CFR Part 11. If you are using a system that is contributing data directly into a database, it needs to be validated. If it's something that is source documentation, that information is being taken from into a case report form, that's different. But we're working in a world where we want to eventually have your EMR linked right into your database. That's where we are moving that way. I know this institution has been working hard on a lot of that stuff, just from my other talks and stuff I do, not maybe this department. But so validation is something, if I need to be 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, and your data that's being submitted to the agency, that's when validation hits. Validation also can be something that's not just computerized. Validating that something is effective, is consistent, is traceable, that's in any documentation within clinical research. That could be another talk, because ICH went crazy on adding stuff like that. So how can you prove when you print from your EMR that I have everything that I need to do my monitoring? Do you actually certify copy it? Or do you have a validated process that you have proven is consistent and is reliable, that as a monitor I don't have to ask you to certify it for me? So I'll get back on topic, but that question's, like I said, $1 million great question. So FDA has said they will never audit your EMR. They will never audit it to 21 CFR Part 11, but they'll expect you to follow the predicate rules. Part 11 is a companion regulation. It never stands alone. So Part 11 is applicable when you're required, based on the main regulations, like 21 CFR 312 and 812, 50, 56, to do certain things as your role. So if you're doing it through an electronic system and it is supporting your role to prove you've done what you've done, it is going into the land of needing to be validated, Part 11. Okay. But they've said in several guidances that they're not going to come in and audit. They will want to know, when we get into the world of pulling data directly from your Epic or whatever it is, that will have to be validated. Yeah.
Thank you. We actually have one other question.
Sure.
So they say a few slides ago you mentioned independent monitoring, independence of sponsor function versus site function. And they were just asking if you could go into this further, unless you're planning to talk about that more later on.
So it is, independent monitoring is independent of the site function, not the sponsor and site function. So they put both on there. So it has to very much be traceable, that this is not, again, the same group that is also working as the investigator delegates. Okay, so yeah, so I just want to make sure I didn't goof and put both words on that slide. That's why I went back. So close your eyes. You're going to go through a little bit of animation here. There you go. So let's talk more about scaling a monitoring strategy. And these are some key steps that are good to think about to go through. So look at your current project or overall projects and see where would oversight need to be. And then you look at who does what roles. So you guys know what a RACI is, like a roles and responsibility matrix. It's good to, you don't have to use that tool, but it's important to know when you're running an IIT, is it clear who's on the sponsor side, who is on the investigator side? And you've got that individual who is, you know, they should have like a yin and yang on their body. They're both the sponsor investigator. So look at making sure that what do we have that's resourceable right within our own institution. You guys have got, you know, I know I'm sitting at Duke, but I know there's other groups on the call. You leverage what you have in your institution if you can for these different types of functions. Some of it will be vendors like labs and things like that. And then where do things intersect and intertwine between sponsor and investigator? And then you're then looking to document where do we need to oversee? Where are the risks on data? Where are the risks on human subject protection? Those are the big ones. And and within that is investigational product. Okay, so sometimes I do 3 categories, but the regulations talk about where do we have a risk to subjects? Where do we have a risk to data? Not every data point, but what's the data that matters? What ICH calls it is focus where it's essential. Don't make your monitoring disproportionate to the risks of your study. Industry goes way bananas. They monitor way too much. They've been scolded and told not to do as much, but do it smarter in a different way. It doesn't mean that they're not monitoring. They're looking to monitor those endpoints, those procedures that if we don't do them, a person's not safe, or my data would be, well. And consent still is of huge importance, because without consent, if I have someone on trial, I'm in big trouble. So a lot of times monitoring plans fall in the realm of a risk plan. Don't worry about what the plan's called, but your monitoring plan should be based on risk. It is your strategy should be based on risk. So a lot of times folks that work in clinical research, we do not have an inherent understanding of risk management. It is a new skill set that everybody needs to understand how to think with a risk mindset. What happens if what I'm doing right now doesn't work right? How severe would it be, and how likely is it to occur that it doesn't go right? And if any of those answers are high up, boom, it's something you focus in your monitoring plan. You're likely to have a difference of opinion cross-functionally, but that's the beauty of debate and having meetings to decide how you're going to do your monitoring. In other words, it might be that data management doesn't think it's risky for this data point, or they might be the ones that are like, hey, it's very risky for if we don't get this data in by this time, and maybe the investigator saying not. So you just eventually come to an agreement where you're going to focus. So in ICH, it talks about monitoring plans. So it says it should focus on trial essential, that's that word again, essential activities. So that's why a template I get a little leery about if it's too detailed, that in every study you must always monitor these things for every patient. Even consent for every patient in a lot of studies, that would just not be possible. Okay, so where would essential activities come in? How can you do it, and can you do it remotely? Maybe it's something you don't have to travel, and of course if it's right here, you're good. So here's the proportionate stuff that I mentioned before. Now, anything that's essential information, then you have to include what are the requirements for what's the collection mechanism, how is this information being collected and documented so you can even look at it. So if something is in a million different places, it's very likely it's going to be very hard to monitor. So is there some place that you can maybe put it in a log or track it or have the system pull your reports? Data management might be a great place to get these reports. So where can I find this information? And if it's hard to get, it's riskier again. if what I want to do, is it even feasible for me to monitor like this? A lot of times we can't afford. The best monitoring would be that we would have these very expensive data analytics systems that would tell me when a blood pressure is too close together with another blood pressure. That's what a lot of sponsors have now. And that's why sometimes a site's getting monitored, is that they got to trigger, you know, a message from their data analytics, and that's what triggers these monitoring visits. Avoid unnecessary complexity in procedures. The other thing is, when you have to defend your monitoring plan, it has to be clear, concise, and consistent. So if I were interviewing you, you would know your monitoring plan, so would you, but I may not have you in the same space. So you sit up front, and I always pick on people that sit up front, so sorry. So ICH E6, the R2 addendum, they added a whole section. They basically took ICH Q9 and dumped it into ICH E6 for quality risk management. But this is really it's quality management or the monitoring. So this is a sponsor responsibility to have this in place. So you may want to take a step back even before monitoring plans, as what kind of risk management do we have in our current quality systems? In our processes, our documentation, our training, all those 6 boxes that I populated earlier. It does not have to be complicated. Do not overcomplicate it, scale it. But these are the steps that they're looking for you to have you integrate into your systems. This will actually help you do a risk-based monitoring plan. Now, if you go into ICH, and this is section 518, so let me just kind of step back here. So this is 5.0, and section 5 in ICH is all sponsor responsibilities. And it talks first that you need this quality management system to be able to oversee and to actually be the sponsor. And then within that's being supported by, in 518, is your monitoring, the extent and nature of monitoring. So it should be, so remember, this is all new. It was not in ICH until end of 2016, is that a monitoring plan should be systematic. I almost said systemic, like a disease. Systematic. So it should look at cross-functionally all that we have to oversee. So it should not just focus on a specific type of activity. Anything that's really sponsor related that you need to oversee, human subject protection, data integrity. It should be prioritized. If we had a hurricane, what would we still do? What is the most important thing that we know for this trial? So if I go to monitor, I know I may not, you know, I remember when I first did a risk-based monitoring plan, monitoring assignment, it was very hard not to look at everything. But I followed my monitoring plan. It might have told me just do this for 100 patients, and they may only gave me a day instead of look at everything for 2 weeks. So prioritized, risk-based approach. That's why I went over section 5 first. Flexible in extent and nature of monitoring. Flexible is great. If this happens, we'll do this. If this many deviations, we do that. So it's basically not, it's not giving you such strict similarity between things. So for example, if this is a new investigator that's never done investigator-initiated trials because they're now a sponsor, we do more. This is what we do. So maybe we're going to monitor the first several patients. Maybe on a trial that this guy or gal has been doing a lot, maybe we trigger monitoring based on volume of enrolled patients. Okay? So see how you can be very clever, and then you look at your budget. Thank you. So we also want varied approaches to improve effectiveness and efficiency of monitoring. And they talk about on-site, remote review, like at your computer desk, and also centralized. So this is those words, actually, centralized. And they're all defined in many different documents, but on-site is obviously you go where the patients are being seen. Combination, they actually put centralized in with remote activity. which is like opening up Epic and looking what the patient's labs were, for example. So you have to have a rationale of the approach, and it needs to be documented. Why are we doing this monitoring plan this way? So these are the definitions. Remote monitoring, notice this is not italics because this is not within ICH. It's embedded within the other two. It doesn't matter how you define these. Make sure you define them the same throughout your studies. So how you define remote monitoring might be that it's got centralized activities, that you're looking at some data management reports. Or remote monitoring might be that you are doing Skype calls and training, which is more almost an extension of on-site. No matter, don't worry about the terms as much as know that you've got lots of choices. There's no requirement to even be on-site at all for any monitoring these days if your rationale is good. So these are just some things about and some examples of centralized monitoring. And we won't go into those, but you can read those. But one thing that is interesting is they talk about selection of sites, how you're going, data that you get or information you get from tracking logs, it doesn't have to be big sophisticated data analytics, might commonly triggers your on-site. So these centralized works with on-site. They don't work in silos. That information needs to be shared across. Okay? So let's think. Oh, compliance with a monitoring plan we mentioned. That's very, very important. So once you commit and have a monitoring plan, make sure you can fulfill it. Now, so this is really monitoring. So if you're thinking, how are we going to make sure or do a gap analysis of how we're currently monitoring our investigator-initiated trials, is within Section 518, it talks about there needs to be standard operating procedures about how you're going to monitor, and then it allows you then to support the strategy per the protocol. You need to then reference for everybody what is the applicable regulations, and then what will be the processes and how we'll actually do the monitoring. So it's really important that when you go into a study that you are all clear on an investigator-initiated trial on what regulations are applicable to the study. And it's not always easy, especially if it's a post-marketing study. So that helps you build your monitoring plan as well. So what percentage are we going to do? How are we going to write our reports? Oh, escalation process. So if I monitor and I find that a subject was enrolled without a consent, so an escalation, part of your procedures to support your monitoring and oversight on the sponsor side needs to be how do you escalate things? So when do I need to notify the FDA? When do I need to update my IND? When do I need to make sure the investigator talk to the IRB? That direction of flow of information. So remember, the monitoring is not just the monitor. It is truly the process of oversight. So in quality management, really very much has to be the basis for supporting your monitoring. And I hope you got the hint that this is not just at a project level. It is very much a system level needs to support the projects on how to rationalize the way they're going to monitor. So you need to be able to defend it, and that you've got a quality system that's supporting this risk-based approach. Okay? So any questions? Because we've got a few slides left, but I want to make sure we've got any questions from the peanut gallery and WebEx. Okay. How about y'all? Anything that I struck a nerve or you want to ask about? Anything? Yes, go ahead. We're going to bring a microphone to you.
So I like the way that you described, this medical monitoring being manageable, feasible. it seems like a lot of the functions would overlap with the reports to the DSMB. So I'm thinking I could document my monitoring in the form of my report to my DSMB signed by the chair.
You know, the DSMB is definitely an independent body. So you'd have an independent review of some information you're sending them. So some of your oversight is definitely your interaction with your DSMB. You'd have to look at what other activities, like source data, to make sure that the data that actually is going into the database that's being provided to the DSMB is real, is accurate, especially for the data that is the most critical. So take a step back before you get to information flowing to the DSMB. The oversight is also oversight of the investigator activities. So that might be a piece you'd still have to increase, for sure. And what would be triggers to actually conduct extra monitoring? You know, you don't want to always be reacting to something that's been triggered that you might even be reporting to the safety group. So what would be some proactive? So think about the quality risk management piece in investigator-initiated trials is what would I add to my program that's proactive looking? Does that help? Okay, good. My eyes are not good to see your face that far away, but good. Anybody else? Yes. Okay.
So you mentioned that the investigator sponsor like the dual roles. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
You mentioned the dual roles and that it wouldn't be the site-specific coordinator that would be overseeing the monitoring plan. So do you have an idea of what kind of roles are best suited for implementation of monitoring?
Yes,
as a sponsor.
Yeah, and then we do have to give them a name, right? So it would have to be where you might borrow. I could foresee monitors in an organization monitoring multiple different studies. Might come from an office of clinical trials or whatever you guys have. However the strategy is, they'd have to have a name, like a research associate, whatever you want to call them. They could even be a coordinator on another study. They just can't have any affiliation in the site side of the study. They can't keep taking their hat off and on. Does that make sense? And it's hard, sometimes staffing. So a lot of groups are hiring these kind of a centralized group of monitoring. And then you'd want to sit in at that table when the monitoring plan's being developed. Okay. Great question. Did that help? So, the next few slides just go over what are the buckets when you're looking at the monitoring plan and what it needs to be considered at risks. You have to look at what are some regulations and obligations, cost containments. These are those industry level things that will help you focus your money and your initiative of monitoring. Then study specific. If you've got a very vulnerable population, a very hard to store product, you have to transport the product, anything that is just risky, those are the things that you're going to focus your monitoring strategy on. Site specific, we've got geographical challenges sometimes, but the experience level, history of compliance, that's when you guys get a rockin' program, is when your investigator-initiated trials, somehow you track that the sponsor investigator, last time there was some challenges, but we worked them out. Well, the next time they're doing a sponsor-initiated trial, man, you need to know that because the agency might know it. So are they improved? Is there new things in place? Maybe you're going to monitor them a little bit more to help them out. It's not that you're trying to give them a hard time. If I'm a sponsor investigator, I want monitoring. I want to know how my team's doing, how am I doing. So it's helping me as well. So this is kind of logical to me. These are some other examples of buckets, risk categories. What is different, new, bad the last time? These are the categories that drive your stuff. So these are risk indicators that if you're looking at a organization, your organizational level, that if you have some of these areas that are not supported, They go into your consideration for your monitoring plan. For example, HR. Who are you staffing as coordinators? And I'm sure you do awesome. But sometimes the capabilities of who is assigned to your study, they don't have the knowledge base they need. And it's risky. So, but that's reality. So if you know that that is not supported from your organizational level, as a sponsor investigator, it's a risk for you, and that you're going to have to supplement with your oversight and your monitoring. The same thing goes with project level. If you have a risky investigational product, your protocol design is tricky and not clear. It's really hard to write a protocol. There's no perfect protocol. Have you ever thought, gosh, we should start from scratch and go again? And so that the protocol brings huge risk in it and interpretation. And these are the operational. Most of your risk at a project level is operational. What is pushing you that might cause people not to perform well? You got to take these into consideration when you're building your monitoring plan. These are the risks. So when you do risk assessment, make sure that the last two slides are on your kind of checklist. Have we evaluated this? Okay? I gave you the resources. So this is just showing you when the monitoring plan comes in. You've got to do risk identification after protocol design. Yeah, I'm just going to do this because I know we're running out of time. I love to talk. Okay. Any questions? I don't want to rush through this, so I know that I don't want to keep you guys too. So any questions from the gallery? Okay. I keep calling them the peanut gallery. I don't mean to, but they're really important. I know that I usually don't mean to ignore them, and I'm trying to be really good about it. So in a nutshell, everything else that's in these slides are the same thing I've talked about. If you look at your warning letter, we might as well end on a really bang. Go to page 7. Citation 6, and this is under sponsor findings. You failed to monitor the progress of the clinical investigation being conducted. They'll always link it to the regulation. And then they talk about that you have to choose that you're ensuring human subject protection, data integrity, and that the methods that were done were not adequate. So that's bottom line. And these are great examples. You know that warning letters are public information on purpose because they are teaching tools, quote unquote, from the agency. So they're really good to look at and to learn without going over the top. I'm definitely, if any theme you got today was scalable. You don't need to break your bank to do really good oversight. Okay. So I'm done. Any questions?
Can we access your slides later?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks so much. See you later. Thank you.